On a luxurious gala night, the powerful and arrogant CEO Marcus Steele forces Naomi, a shy janitor, to sing in front of an audience to humiliate her. What he didn't expect was that her extraordinary voice would silence the room and change their lives forever. A story of talent, overcoming challenges, and justice that you can't miss. In the pulsating heart of New York, Steel Industries stands tall, a symbol of power and wealth. Its glass floors reflect the grandeur of the city, but they also conceal an environment of unbridled ambition and cruelty. At the helm of this empire, Marcus Steele, the CEO, is the living portrait of success, but his victories are often built on the disdain and humiliation of his subordinates. Marcus, a man in his 50s, maintains an impeccable appearance. His Seville rose suit, always perfectly tailored, and the wristwatch that cost more than the annual salary of many of his employees are merely extensions of his arrogant personality. He is known for his speeches at lavish events, where he extols the company's profits and his own competence, while his subordinates are left in the shadows, treated as mere disposable instruments. In the cold, sophisticated corridors of Steel Industries, Marcus walks with an air of superiority. He does not hesitate to humiliate employees in public, whether for a minor mistake or simply on a whim. During an important meeting, he interrupted Sarah, a marketing manager, with a cruel smile. "If you can't understand something so simple, maybe you should reconsider your position here." The awkward silence that followed was broken only by the sound of suppressed laughter from some executives accompanying him. Meanwhile, Naomi Johnson, a young janitor just 24 years old, is invisibly present, cleaning the same corridors that Marcus walks through. Black and shy, Naomi is the opposite of the glamorous world of Steel Industries. She started working at the company a few months ago, and her quiet effort to keep the environment clean and organized makes her an almost ghostly figure in the eyes of the executives. No one notices her, and that is how she prefers it. Naomi wears simple, ill-fitting uniforms, her curly hair tied up in a messy bun, and her always serious face reveals little about the challenges she faces daily. As Naomi wipes the shiny floor of the executive floor, the sound of firm footsteps approaches. She barely lifts her eyes, used to being ignored. Marcus, coming in her direction, does not bother to divert to avoid contact. He strides forward, almost as if the ground beneath his feet were above any dirt a janitor could cause. Naomi, holding her bucket firmly, feels the wind of his hurried passage, but continues her work, knowing that nothing will change her reality. In the rare moments when the building's silence is broken by conversations about the CEO, the closest employees comment on his lack of empathy. "He treats everyone as if we are nothing," murmurs Julia, a receptionist, while Naomi, gliding softly between the desks, pretends not to hear. The truth is that behind her shyness, Naomi also possesses a strong sense of justice. She sees the silent suffering of her colleagues, but unable to do anything, she remains in the shadows, like a spectator of a cruel drama. And so, the worlds of Marcus Steele and Naomi Johnson coexist, separated by an invisible barrier of power and social class. He, the man who commands an empire, and she, the woman who cleans the traces of his greatness, barely touch, but both are involved in a silent dance that, at some point, will forever change their lives. That night, the upper floor of Steel Industries was transformed into a true palace of luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, reflecting the soft light that enveloped the elegantly set tables adorned with white linens, silverware, and crystal glasses. The air was infused with sophisticated perfumes, and the murmur of conversations in soft tones created an atmosphere of exclusivity. Marcus Steele, surrounded by investors and high-ranking executives, moved with the confidence of someone who controls not just a company, but the entire environment around him. The guests laughed at his arrogant jokes, and he shone under the spotlight he had created for himself. However, behind his charming smile, there was a cruel plan he was about to execute. Naomi Johnson, as usual, was invisible to most. She moved silently among the guests, discreetly cleaning up the remnants of drinks and crumbs left on the tables. Dressed in her simple uniform, Naomi hardly seemed part of that world of ostentation. To the executives, she was just a shadow passing by unnoticed. But Marcus watched her with a malicious interest. As Naomi crouched down to clean a stain on the floor, Marcus approached his smile widening with a mischievous idea. He knew her only by sight, the shy janitor who never complained, but somehow seemed to carry a silent dignity that bothered him. He decided that this woman would be the perfect target for his prank. "Naomi, isn't it?" Marcus said, his voice initially soft, almost friendly. Naomi looked up, surprised to be addressed. She hesitated, wiping her hands on the cloth she carried. "Yes, sir," she replied quietly. "You do a wonderful job, you know. You keep everything so clean and organized," he continued, forcing a tone of kindness that did not reflect his true intention. Naomi, unaware of what was coming, murmured a thank you, lacking the courage to meet the CEO's piercing gaze. Marcus leaned in a little closer, slightly bending as if to confide something special. "I had an idea for dinner," he began, a cruel glint in his eyes. "The guests would love to see you sing. An unusual performance to liven up the night. What do you think?" Naomi froze. The idea of singing in front of so many people terrified her. She had never done anything like that, and knew her voice was weak and uncertain. I don't know if I'm good enough, sir," she replied, the nervousness evident in her voice. Marcus, disguising his pleasure with a smile, insisted, "Oh, don't be modest. Everyone would love it. Besides, it would be a great way to show how our team values hard work, don't you think? You can prepare something quick for later, right?" He spoke with authority, making it clear that he would not accept a no as an answer. Naomi, unaware of the trap he had set, felt pressure to agree. "All right, sir," she said, almost in a whisper, as fear began to take hold of her. Marcus stepped back, a malicious smile on his face. He knew that Naomi, with her shyness and insecurity, would be easily embarrassed in front of the guests. His intention was clear: to use her as a spectacle of humiliation to entertain the investors and reinforce his own power. With this, he would secure ephemeral laughter and temporary applause, but at the cost of another person's dignity. The gala dinner was in full swing, laughter and conversations intensifying as the guests enjoyed exquisite dishes and expensive wines. Marcus, now at the center of attention, made a dramatic gesture to call for silence in the room. Everyone's gaze turned to him, curious and expectant. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice resonating with authority, "I have the pleasure of presenting a special surprise for tonight. Our dedicated janitor, Naomi, will grace us with a song." He gestured to Naomi, who was still nearby, cleaning a table, unsure of what to do. Naomi's heart raced. She looked around, trying to understand what was happening, but it was in vain. Marcus's mischievous smile and the curious looks from the guests made it clear that she had no choice. Sir, I don't want to," she tried, but her voice barely came out. "Oh, don't be shy, Naomi," Marcus interrupted, his voice now more firm. "Everyone is excited to hear you. Come on, get up on stage." He pointed to the microphone set up on a small stage at the back of the hall. Naomi felt her face burn with embarrassment. Panic began to take over her, but Marcus's steady gaze paralyzed her. She knew she couldn't disobey. The audience watched, some men stifling smiles, while other women whispered among themselves, noticing the young woman's resistance. The atmosphere grew tense, a mix of discomfort and curiosity hanging in the air. No one dared to intervene, as everyone knew the power of Marcus Steele and the impact he had on the company and their lives. With trembling hands, Naomi climbed onto the stage, the microphone feeling like it weighed a ton in her hand. She looked at the audience, and fear overtook her expression. The faces around her were blurs, and she felt that any movement could make her crumble. Naomi took a deep breath, trying to contain her nervousness, but her voice came out almost as a whisper. "I'm sorry, I don't know if I can." Marcus was there beside her, with a smile that hid his true intention. He leaned toward the audience and said in a playful tone, "Naomi is so modest, but I'm sure she will surprise us." Naomi forced herself to close her eyes for a moment, embarrassment wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. The silence in the hall seemed to scream against her, and the weight of expectations was almost unbearable. She knew that what she was about to do could end in humiliation, but there was no turning back. With her hands still shaking, Naomi prepared to begin. Silence fell again over the room, and all eyes were on her. Naomi, feeling the butterflies in her stomach, adjusted the microphone and, even with her voice almost inaudible, began to utter the first verse of a simple song she knew from her childhood, a melody that spoke of hope and strength in the face of difficulties. She felt that at any moment someone might laugh or interrupt, but there was no way to escape. As she prepared to continue, the atmosphere was filled with expectation and tension, and Naomi barely knew that this moment would change everything around her. With her heart racing, Naomi closed her eyes and let the first chords of the song flow from her memory. The beginning was hesitant, her trembling voice almost getting lost in the luxurious air of the hall. But as she continued, something inside her began to awaken. The music spoke of overcoming and hope, and those words seemed to resonate deeply in her soul. When Naomi reached the chorus, her voice, which had started so timidly, soared surprisingly, carrying a strength and emotion that no one in the hall expected. The room, which had been filled with murmurs and nervous giggles, fell into absolute silence. The guests stopped to listen, incredulous at what they were witnessing. Naomi, the invisible caretaker who cleaned up after their parties, was now on stage, singing with a depth that moved everyone. With each verse, Naomi seemed to transform. Her serene and focused expression showed that, despite her fear, she was completely surrendering to that song. Her vocal technique was impeccable. She controlled the notes with mastery, her inflections conveying a sadness and hope that touched the hearts of all present. The guests began exchanging surprised glances, unable to believe that this simple woman, who cleaned the floor they walked on, possessed such extraordinary talent. Marcus, who had initially been sure that Naomi would become the object of his humiliation, now watched with his mouth agape. He had never imagined that such a simple employee could have such a powerful voice. The guests closest to her began to lean forward, glued to their seats, while others, with tears in their eyes, started to become emotional. Naomi continued, growing more confident, her voice echoing through the walls of the hall like a calm storm. The final flourish of the song was a climax of pure emotion. She reached an impressive note, holding it for long seconds before gently descending, finishing with a whisper that seemed to leave the air around suspended. When the last note faded, a profound silence took over the place. No one dared to move or speak. It was as if time had stopped for a moment. Naomi stood there, holding the microphone with trembling hands, her face pale with shock and disbelief. She could hardly believe what she had just done and now anxiously awaited the laughter or criticism that might follow. As soon as Naomi finished singing, a deep silence filled the hall, as if time had frozen for a brief moment. The young woman still held the microphone, her hands trembling, her gaze lost between the floor and the audience, fearing the inevitable laughter or embarrassment that might follow. But, to her surprise, the silence was quickly broken by an explosive round of applause that reverberated off the luxurious walls of the room. The guests, who had initially been there just to enjoy a fine dinner, were completely impressed. Many stood up from their chairs, applauding enthusiastically, and the sound of clapping filled the atmosphere with vibrant energy. The mood, which had previously been one of discomfort and curiosity, transformed into a wave of reverence and admiration. Naomi, still dazed, could hardly comprehend what was happening. She looked around and saw emotional faces, eyes shining with surprise and respect. Several guests began to comment among themselves, their murmurs growing louder as admiration for her talent spread throughout the hall. "Did you hear that? She's amazing," said a woman at the next table, her hand covering her face, visibly moved. An older man, with a serious expression, shook his head in disbelief. "I never thought a cleaning staff member could have a voice like that. This is extraordinary." As the applause continued, Naomi began to realize that this moment was not what she had imagined. What should have been a cruel joke orchestrated by Marcus Steele to humiliate her had turned into something profoundly meaningful. She was still with tears in her eyes, unable to contain her emotion, when she looked at Marcus, who was standing beside her, completely stunned. The CEO, who had previously been so confident in his control over the situation, now seemed lost and unsure of how to react. His forced smile had vanished, and he watched Naomi with an expression of shock and disbelief. The other guests, many of them high-ranking executives, began to cast disapproving glances at Marcus, clearly realizing that he had tried to ridicule this talented woman. One of the most influential investors, a respected and feared businessman, turned to Marcus and said firmly, "That was completely inappropriate. You shouldn't have put that young woman in such a situation." His voice carried weight, and Marcus felt the embarrassment grow as he realized he had lost control not only over Naomi, but over the entire room. Naomi, still in shock from the audience's reaction, began to step down from the stage, her face hidden in her hands, trying to hold back her tears. But the applause only grew louder, and the people around her were standing up even more, recognizing not only her talent, but also the injustice of the situation she had faced. Marcus Steele tried with all his might to maintain his composure. He straightened his shoulders and forced a smile that no longer reflected the confidence that had once dominated the room. But as the applause continued and the guests' gazes, especially those of the most influential investors, began to turn against him, his expression of arrogance started to crumble. "Why did you do that, Marcus?" asked one of the executives, a middle-aged man named Gerald Mason, with a serious expression on his face. "You knew she didn't want to sing. That was unnecessary and cruel." Mason's words echoed amid the growing murmur in the room, and other guests began to voice their opinions. There was a clear shift in the air. The respect Marcus used to command was dissipating, replaced by disappointment and indignation. The attempt at humiliation he had planned for Naomi was now seen by everyone for what it truly was, a senseless cruelty. Mr. Thompson, one of the most powerful and respected investors in the room, shook his head in disgust. He stepped forward, his imposing figure reflecting the seriousness of his words. "This is unacceptable, Marcus. I no longer want to do business with someone who treats their employees this way. Naomi just demonstrated exceptional talent, and she should be valued, not used as the butt of jokes." Mr. Thompson's words cut through the heavy air of the room. Marcus felt his face burn with shame. He was surrounded by looks of disappointment and reproach, and the reality of his situation began to sink in. The guests who had once laughed at his jokes now looked at him with disdain, and the figure of power he had always been seemed to crumble before the reality of his actions. I just wanted to... It was a joke," Marcus tried to justify, but his voice sounded weak and unconvincing. He knew he was losing control of the situation, and every word that came out of his mouth only deepened the hole he had dug for himself. The murmurs among the guests grew louder, and many began to distance themselves from him, regrouping around Naomi, who was still in shock, barely believing what had just happened. She was trying, timidly, to retreat from the attention, but the guests were approaching to praise her and applaud her talent. Marcus, feeling increasingly isolated, looked at Naomi, who was now receiving the recognition that should have been given to her from the start. The contemptuous look he had always had towards her began to fade, replaced by a mix of anger and shame as he realized that his attempt at control had miserably failed. The sense of power he had always held over Steel Industries and everyone who worked there was slipping away. He terrifyingly realized that he had not only underestimated Naomi, but also underestimated the impact of his own malice. Now, surrounded by looks of disappointment and indignation, Marcus Steele found himself in the position of a man who had lost everything: the respect of his investors, control over his own company, and more importantly, the recognition that his arrogance could be his greatest weakness. Naomi, still trembling and unsure how to react, tried to avoid attention, but the guests were determined to approach her. An elderly man, with a gentle voice, held her hand and said, "You were wonderful, young lady. Never let anyone diminish your worth." It was then that an imposing and respected figure in the music world approached. Mrs. Rivera, an influential music producer known for discovering and launching great talents, looked directly into Naomi's eyes. Her presence was both warm and powerful, and Naomi could barely comprehend what was happening around her. "Dear, I am Mrs. Rivera," the producer began with a kind smile. "What you did here tonight was incredible. Your voice is something truly special. I would like to help you turn this into a career." Naomi, still in shock, slowly shook her head, unsure if she was dreaming. "I thank you, but I don't know. Let me be clear," Mrs. Rivera interrupted firmly. "I want you to record an album. I want you to become a professional artist. You have a talent that cannot be ignored, and I want to make sure the world hears your voice." Mrs. Rivera's words began to slowly penetrate Naomi's mind, and she felt the weight of the proposal. The idea of leaving her job as a janitor to pursue a career in music was something she had never dared to imagine. With tears in her eyes, Naomi finally found the courage to respond. "Yes, I accept. I want to try. But I don't know if I'm good enough." "You are more than good enough, dear," Mrs. Rivera said, holding her hand firmly. "Trust me, we will make this happen." The hall, which was still filled with murmurs of support and disdain for Marcus, now lit up with the news of the contract. The guests began to celebrate around Naomi, many of them applauding again, while others expressed their happiness for the young woman. Naomi, still dazed and with tears streaming down her face, felt that her life was about to change completely, but she couldn't process how quickly everything had happened. Meanwhile, Marcus Steele remained on the sidelines, unable to digest the reality of his sudden downfall. He watched helplessly as Naomi received the attention and respect he never believed she deserved. The room, which had once been dominated by his authority, now pulsed with a new kind of energy, an energy of justice and recognition. And Naomi, the woman he had tried to humiliate, was at the center of it all. The next day, the steel industries building was enveloped in a palpable atmosphere of change. Naomi Johnson, who had been just an invisible shadow for months, was now the center of attention. Upon arriving at work, she could hardly believe the number of colleagues who approached to congratulate her. Employees who had once trembled at the mention of Marcus Steele's name were now gathering around her, offering support and respect. "You were amazing, Naomi," said Julia, the receptionist, with tears in her eyes. "No one ever imagined you had this talent. We know how much you suffered from the way he treated all of us." Naomi, with a tight heart, tried to process what was happening. She had always been a discreet employee, doing her job without expecting recognition. Now, her colleagues were coming together to celebrate not only her talent, but also what her victory represented for all of them, a breaking of the fear that Marcus imposed on the company environment. At the end of the day, Naomi said goodbye to her job as a janitor. As she gathered her things, she felt a mix of emotions. She looked around, realizing that this building would never be the same for her. The walls, which had once seemed cold and distant, were now filled with memories, both of her silent struggles and the moment when her voice was finally heard. When Naomi walked out the main door, a new sense of freedom enveloped her. The future, once uncertain and bleak, now shone before her. She knew her life was about to change forever. With the contract offered by Mrs. Rivera, Naomi was about to embark on a new journey as a singer, and her voice would finally have space to shine. Meanwhile, Marcus Steele faced a very different reality. In the halls of steel industries, the atmosphere of respect and admiration for Naomi began to transform into a wave of discontent against him. Investors who had previously stood by his side started to pull away, concerned about his conduct and the company's image. The consequences of his arrogance were beginning to settle in, and he felt control over his empire slipping through his fingers. "We're losing major investors, Marcus," warned Gerald Mason, with a look of disappointment. "Your behavior has caused more damage than you realize." Marcus, visibly irritated, tried to argue, but the words felt empty. He knew he had crossed the line by trying to humiliate Naomi, and now he was paying the price for it. His authority, which had once been unquestionable, was beginning to be challenged by everyone around him. As the days went by, Naomi began her new life in the recording studio. The environment was filled with sophisticated equipment and talented producers, and Naomi felt both excited and nervous. She entered the studio, and the silence that followed was broken by the producer beside her, who smiled encouragingly. "Are you ready to record your first track?" he asked, and Naomi, with her heart racing, nodded. She knew this was just the beginning of her journey to stardom, and as she prepared to sing, she felt that she was finally in the place she had always belonged. Thus, the story of Naomi Johnson, the janitor who became a singer, began to be written, while Marcus Steele, the arrogant CEO, faced the consequences of his downfall. The future of both was sealed, and the steel industry's building would never be the same for either of them. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to continue watching.